This session is a session of the Theology Without Walls group devoted to the topic Spirit, Chi, Divine Energies as a transreligious complex of categories. And one thing the call said that Theology Without Walls needs is concepts, ones that are given not just for the purpose of comparison, but can be used to think in ways that are not thoroughly determined by any one particular religious perspective. So this panel, we have a wonderful group of presenters to open up and explore possibilities for creative theological construction and reflection that this particular cluster of concepts might open up for us. And I'm going to suggest that we'll hear from each of them in order, and after each presentation, we'll pause for just a couple of minutes. Janine Dillard set a great example, I think, in the prior session. Just a couple of minutes for people to enter into the chat any questions or responses they would like to register for the sake of the group and the presenter. At the end of all the presentations, I'll invite each of the speakers to have a brief time to respond to what they've heard from another speaker or what they might have read in the chat as a comment from one of the participants. So I'll remind us again about that as we go. So our presenters today, Benjamin Crace is Assistant Professor of English Language and Literature at the American University of Kuwait. He comes to us from at least 12 hours different time zone-wise, I think, at the moment. Professor Crace is an interdisciplinary scholar, but a particular note for our topic, he's done master's and doctoral level work in charismatic studies, bearing both on Pentecostal traditions and on theosis and pneumatic piety in the Coptic tradition. And that latter is the theme of his doctoral dissertation. He's speaking today on the topic, Stoic Cosmological Foundations for a Contemporary Pneumatology. Robert Neville, who is the Emeritus Professor of Philosophy, Religion, and Theology at Boston University, hardly needs an introduction to this group on this topic, I think, since he's a pioneer scholar in the entire area of comparative theology, but particularly in relating Chinese traditions and Christianity. His numerous academic leadership roles have included serving as president of the International Society for Chinese Philosophy. And among his many publications, two in particular, I think, are especially relevant to our topic today, the book Boston Confucianism from the year 2000 and Ritual and Deference, Extending Chinese Philosophy in a Comparative Context, 2008. His presentation today is entitled The Cosmological Use of Spirit. Then Dr. Hyodong Lee is Associate Professor of Comparative Theology at Drew Theological School. Professor Lee's research and teaching interests include comparative theology and comparative philosophy of religion, with a focus on the dialogue between the Christian Western theological and philosophical traditions and Northeast Asian philosophical and religious thought. For today's topic, Professor Lee could be said to have written the book, or at least one of them, Spirit, He, and the Multitude, a comparative theology for the democracy of creation from 2013. His presentation for us today is titled Divine Key, K-I, parenthesis Q-I, close parenthesis, question mark, Divine Key, Musings on a Cross-Cultural Pneumatology. And then Dr. Grace Ji-Sun Kim is Professor of Theology at the Earlham School of Theology. Professor Kim is a discouragingly prolific author, touching on so many areas in theology with so many publications. In reference to our theme today, there are two books that stand out to me, at least, Reimagining Spirit, Light, Wind, and Vibration from 2019, and The Holy Spirit, Chi, and the Other, a model of global and intercultural pneumatology from 2011. And I think a third book is on its way or about to appear, entitled Spirit Life, with the date of 2022. That's a kind of futuristic reference. The topic for her presentation today is Spirit, Chi, and Christianity. And finally, Professor David Bradshaw is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Kentucky. Professor Bradshaw's scholarship is focused on philosophy and religious thought in the worlds of Eastern and Western Christianity, including the very notable book, Aristotle, East and West, Metaphysics and the Division of Christendom from 2004. For the purposes of today's discussion, I would take special note of his article in St. Vladimir's Seminary Theological Quarterly, The Divine Energies in the New Testament from 2006. His topic today is the divine energy in Eastern Christianity. So with those brief introductions, I'll turn to Professor Crace to begin.
All right, thank you, Mark. Appreciate that. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you folks. I'm glad I get to go first, so I don't sound as derivative as I feel. So I'm going to get through this here. Stoicism has been trending recently as an ancient antidote for late modernity's existential angst. Of course, this reappropriation has largely included a stripping away of the ideal and metaphysical aspects of Stoic thought. The end game for such populist endeavors seems to be twofold. One, demonstrate how Marcus Aurelius and Seneca prefigure the latest TED Talk. And two, open a niche within neoliberalism's colonizing self-help market. Outside of the popularized version, Stoicism has enjoyed a relative revival within biblical studies. Although it has been common for many years to tease out the influence of Platonism, Stoic, in particular Middle Platonism, Stoic elements have received less attention. Though heavily criticized by scholars like N.T. Wright, Danish theologian Troels Ingberg Petersen has been at the forefront of illuminating the ways in which Stoicism influenced Paul and John's thought in the New Testament. While acknowledging that Stoicism was not the determining stream, Ingberg Petersen builds a strong case for how important its cosmology ontology was for a central idea in the Pauline corpus and John's gospel, and that idea is pneuma. Pneuma, most often translated as spirit in English, occurs throughout the New Testament. In Stoic thought, around the same period, pneuma was an actual substance rather than an immaterial something, defined as the antithesis of matter, which is typical in kind of modern thought. Ingberg Petersen calls it the, quote, material spirit. This renders a material spectrum with pneuma on one end and solid matter on the other, rather than a dualistic material-immaterial dichotomy. A material spirit in this construal unties and reconfigures various knots in scholarly shibboleths in biblical studies. A Stoic-derived pneumatology within a Christian narrative has exciting possibilities since it provides a conceptual schema for a phenomenological account of one of the fastest growing spiritual movements on earth, and that's Pentecostalism. Pentecostals claim a direct experience of the Holy Spirit. This direct experience, they maintain, has physical effects. Even the lightest encounter with Pentecostalism supports popularized and characterized body movements of those, quote, under the Spirit. People possessed by the holy, they dance, they fall down, they speak in other tongues, they shake, they laugh, and even bark. To outsiders, the whole range of these manifestations are perplexing at best, if not symptomatic of some kind of psychopathology at worst. What they definitely are not, for many of the onlookers and scholars, is some kind of, quote, spiritual experience, since these, for many, are immaterial and mostly noetic by definition. Yet when a Stoic-derived material spirit rooted in the New Testament itself is combined together with the countless empirical accounts of Pentecostals, it obtains a consistent and coherent account that has practical and ecumenical purchase. Towards the Orthodox and Catholics, Protestant Pentecostals can revisit what sacramentalism entails. In dialogue with burgeoning new religious movements, New Age spiritualities, and various 21st century esoterica revivals, a material spirit affirms the generalized intuition that there is an underlying unity to the phenomenal. In short, this presentation seeks to model how ancient Western philosophy may be deployed in interdisciplinary contexts and sketch out the possibilities such a deployment might entail. At the very least, mutual understanding lessens distrust and raises appreciation for the spiritual other. So perhaps the primary source for reinterpreting the New Testament in light of Stoicism comes from Troels Ingberg Petersen. I think he's Danish. Ingberg Petersen's main contributions here include Cosmology and Self and the Apostle Paul, the Material Spirit. And then that's 2011. And then more recently, John in Philosophy, a new reading of the Fourth Gospel, and that's 2017. In the former text, Ingberg Petersen makes the claim that what has typically been taken metaphorical should also be taken literally in what he calls a, quote, realist cosmology. The hinge on which his argument moves is in positing that Paul's worldview subscribed to a physicalist account of pneuma sourced by Hellenistic philosophy, Stoicism in particular. A substantive pneuma allows metaphors and symbols to take on objective realist dimensions. I take, for example, Paul's use of the phrase in Christ. Taken one way, this could mean that one is in right relationship with God, with believers, or that one's been baptized or is attempting to live a Christian life of obedience to the church's teachings. By inserting the material spirit, quote, in Christ becomes having one's body, which is literally informed by the physical spirit, be a part of Christ, who is himself made of pneuma. Or it may mean having one's body be a material part of the body of Christ, which is made of the physical pneuma, end quote. In terms of Johannine thought, Ingrid Peterson grafts the peculiar term logos onto his substantive pneuma. Quote, logos and pneuma are two sides of the same coin, one cognitive and epistemological, the other ontological, physical, and directly active in bringing about things in the world, end quote. Charles Ingrid Peterson is not the only scholar to underscore the material nature of pneuma. David Litwa, in his work on the Eastern Christian doctrine of theosis or divinization, highlights the same qualities drawing from the same Greek wells. Quote, scholars and exegetes are more and more coming to the conclusion that pneuma did not mean immaterial spirit. It is more suitably translated by breath or wind. Among ancient philosophers and medical professionals, it was thought of as a corporeal substance, though not solid earthly substance like earth and water. It was much more like air. Air, however, was thought to be naturally cold and misty, whereas pneuma was hot, fiery, fine, and subtle, end quote. In this schema, when mixed with air, pneuma became ether and formed the substance of the human soul. Aspects of this Stoic understanding then get carried over into the New Testament. In Paul's theology of a pneumatic body from 1 Corinthians 15, verses 48 through 9, Litwa argues that, quote, Paul's pneumatic body is not flesh and blood, but a finer, purer, subtler substance not subject to decay, end quote. It's a body infused with pneuma. He goes on to argue very persuasively that this is part of becoming Christ-like. Quote, believers assimilate to the glorious body of the divine Christ. In this way, they receive an immortal body made up of fine, ethereal stuff called pneuma, end quote. And both Litwa and Ingrid Peterson, Cartesian dualism with all of its intended Neoplatonic hangups is exchanged for what, as will be shown later, a kind of dual aspect monism. If we substitute, as Roderick Main does, life or even consciousness in place of spirit, then consciousness coheres so well with our material bodies because it emerges from the same base reality that is neither fully material nor fully conscious. You could say it's experiential if you're going the pan-experiential route there. Pentecostalism and charismaticism, often grouped together as the PC movement, resist sharp demarcations, ideologies, and definitions. Although the taxonomies and definitions vary, suffice it to say that the PC movement places a strong emphasis on what Alan Anderson calls, quote, an ecstatic experience of the spirit and a tangible practice of spiritual gifts, end quote. To be sure, the PC movement is not limited to certain denominations, but is descriptive of a global phenomenon that has impacted free churches as well as the older apostolic traditions. I'm thinking in particular the Catholic charismatic revival. Moreover, the PC movement emphasizes the availability of such pneumatic experiences for everyone, everywhere. From this, we can see that Pentecostalism, broadly speaking, underscores experience, tangibility, and egalitarian access, a kind of Main Street mysticism, as Margaret Paloma has noted. Such emphases make it wide open to phenomenological research that should lead towards the interrogation of deeper philosophical assumptions. And this is what I'm up to here. What ontologies are implied by these experiences if we move inductively from the descriptions backward? Briefly, there are as many mystical claims to experiencing the tangible or felt presence of God as Holy Spirit within PC communities as there are PC Christians. But by far the most common pneumatic experiences, or what PC Christians call manifestations, are being slain in the spirit, that is, experiencing a force pushing one down or pinning one to the floor, speaking in tongues, or prophesying, which is a type of pneumatic manipulation of the physical speech organs, and then, of course, shaking or twitching. However, moving beyond the individual subject to perhaps the more objectified extremed manifestations, these can include miraculous healings, immunity from poison, and even inflammability. Taken prima facie, these pneumatically attributed manifestations appear to have a substantive cause that changes physicality. One could call this cause superphysicality rather than immaterial. It is precisely here on the realm of quotidian experience of millions that spirit emerges as a substance and not an immaterial nothingness with no effect on perceived reality. It's definitely not a mental reality, or simply a mental reality. I don't feel like such a conclusion is forced unless one is already committed to a type of Neoplatonically inclined theology that needs to keep the wall between the spiritual and material. This is existentially evident in the sheer intellectualism that's dominated a vast majority of Christian traditions. Hopefully, more and more scholars are looking at the role embodiment plays in the Christian life, attempting to overcome the Cartesian split. I believe this substantive Stoic-derived model can assist in these endeavors. This is a material spirit in conversation with the apostolic traditions. Both apostolic traditions, the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox, here I'm including Oriental and Eastern, hold to a realist position on the Eucharist. That is, the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. While the Catholics describe this change through the doctrine of transubstantiation, the Orthodox have resisted such fine-tuning. But this view on the Eucharist fits more broadly within what could be called a sacramental worldview. In this construal, spirit permeates all of reality, interpenetrates it. This is especially evident in the more Eastern teaching of theosis, where God's spirit permeates the believer in much the same way as fire permeates hot iron. A material spirit then coheres well with sacramentality because, like Ingberg Peterson suggests, the metaphoric is no longer idealistically bound. It can physically participate in the spirit through activities, as eating, drinking, or whatever, because of the superphysicality of pneuma. I do not have to be psychologically or cognitively cognizant of the spirit world in each particular moment of my conscious activity because my body already is a part of that reality. Or to use Whiteheadian terms, my body prehends it before my consciousness perceives it. I do want to be careful here because there is a difference between the substance, the category, and the individual. Human bodies are roughly made from the same physical elements, and every individual participates, as it were, in humanity at large. But there's only one me, and Christians make similar distinctions between what spirit is, pneuma, and who spirit is. This is when the adjective holy is used throughout the New Testament. When it's referenced in the Bible, it refers to an agent capable of action, epistemological and materially. It has causes. But it equally underscores a significant level of personality as well. This personality, overlaid as it were on top of the substance known as pneuma, in much the same way the human personality coheres with one's body, seemed to be a type of cosmic extension of the personality exhibited by Jesus of Nazareth as recorded in the Gospels, which is where you get this Spirit of Christ language. The technical theological language precludes the Holy Spirit from being Jesus as a ghost, but shared substance allows for unity and transference of a recognizable personality with attendant idiosyncrasies and peculiarities. Such personal characteristics may be lost if Christians fail to maintain a distinction in dialogue between pneuma and holy pneuma, as the New Testament does. Nonetheless, normative claims can be bracketed out if these distinctions are clearly drawn. A Stoic-derived pneumatology, with all of its attendant ontological and epistemological substrata, harmonizes well with the general trend in the sciences towards holistic accounts of reality. Jeffrey Kripal, who was just on our last unit here, our last session, he explains a similar position. Quote, I'm probably closest to David Ray Griffin's non-dualist interactionism, or better still, the dual aspect monism proposed by quantum theorist Harold Atmanspacher out of his extensive work on the Jung-Pauli dialogue that posits an unus mundus, or one world of now, beneath the complementary domains of the mental and material that split off this deeper reality or ground within our own brain-mediated temporal experience, end quote. Real or phenomenal, unified, holistic thinking privileges health and wholeness more than distinction and division. In more contemporary terms, the unus mundi is pure energy. Such spiritual usage goes back all the way to Cyril of Alexandria, perhaps the first to use the term divine energy. Or as quantum physicist Wolfgang Pauli once asked, what remains of the old ideas of matter and substance? The answer is energy. This is the true substance, that which is conserved. Only the form in which it appears is changing. We now have the full evolution. The Stoic pneuma becomes energy, a quantum reality, a force. But how does reframing pneumatology in terms of amorphous energy pave the way to interreligious and interfaith here what I would prefer to simply call spiritual dialogue? The West is in the beginning stages of a post-secular turn. Our culture is opening up again to the possibility that the Enlightenment's dogmaticism that grounded materialism is incapable of explaining the meaning of life. According to John McClure, post-secularism is a mode of being and seeing that is at once critical of secular constructions of reality and of dogmatic religiosity. This post-secular turn has increased scholarly attention to the rise of alternative spiritualities and the spiritual but not religious category. Remarkably, in the wake of the failed secularization hypothesis, people are wanting to be thought of as more attuned to the cosmic order of things and the spirit than has perhaps occurred in centuries. Again, Roderick Mayne notes this change in terms of a movement from religion to spirituality. He says, religion is very much God-centered, and especially since the 1960s, has increasingly come to be seen as that which is institutionalized. For many, it has come to be associated with the formal, dogmatic, and hierarchical, if not the impersonal and patriarchal. Spirituality, on the other hand, has to do with the personal, that which is interior or imminent, that which is one's experienced relationship with the sacred, and that wisdom or knowledge which derives from such experiences. At heart, spirituality has come to mean life. Life, rather than what transcends life, becomes God. This contemporary spirituality may be more precisely termed spirituality of life, end quote. In short, the time is ripe for religious scholars to provide conceptual schemas to help navigate these emergent discourses. In line with these shifts, a material spirit has an intuitive and empirical advantage over the classic material-immaterial divide. It also has the auratic quality of the ancient past as well as the quantum present. It is in line with a growing uneasiness with secularities that ignore or reduce human experience to non-transcendent neuronal firing and religious dogma that promotes a sharp break with lived experience in the environment.
Thank you very much. Not least of which for fitting within our time frame so expeditiously. So we'll take a couple of moments now for you to reflect, put into the chat thoughts, comments, questions you might have for Professor Crace or in relation to his presentation. We'll be holding those, saving those for response at a later point here.
Yeah, the physics of pneumatology is more just a gestural moment that I'm just pointing towards how it can connect both to Pentecostalism, apostolic traditions, and also in the emerging science and theology dialogue. I haven't really engaged it that much. I still want to do more with process ontology before I really get into the science dialogue.
Okay, people can continue to put things into the chat if you wish, but we'll turn to Professor Neville next. think I'm trying to unmute you, Bob, but I think you'll have to do it from your computer.
It's on the bottom left, if you're looking.
Yeah, if there's a little
on your screen.
Little microphone icon that you can see in the bottom left. I can mute all, but I can't unmute all. That's the limitations of omnipotence from this host position, it appears. Perhaps I'll say if it's going to, oh, maybe we've gotten assistance.
Very good. Okay.
Wonderful.
Okay. Thank you very much. My talk is about the cosmological use of spirit, and it's the spirit and its equivalents in South Asia and East Asian religions is an extremely complicated, confused, and varying phenomenon. Perhaps its vaguest common meaning is something that moves with power and direction. But to say much more requires distinctions, which I'll now make. In these brief remarks, I'm going to speak only generally about the East Asian Qi and West Asian versions of spirit. For West Asian religions, spirit stands in some contrast or other with matter. The basic distinction here concerns living things, which are combinations of both matter and spirit. But when things die, the connection between their matter and spirit is complicated. For most traditions, the matter simply returns to earth or is burnt, whereas the thing's spirit is due greater honor, being immortal, long-lived, perhaps transferred to a new material body, short-lived, or now dead in death, but that which made the live body live. Ghosts, by and large, are mainly spiritual. An important strain of ancient Judaism believed that the spirits of the dead slowly evaporate after death. One strain of Judaism believed that God's creative word is distinct from God himself and is a spirit, usually female. It was permissible for Jews to believe this in the Jerusalem Talmud, but the later Babylonian Talmud believed that this allowed too much diversity in God, who remained only himself while speaking words. The Christian Gospel of John believed that the creative divine spirit, which is called Logos, which male, became united with the man Jesus. According to this gospel, Jesus had a divine spirit, whereas ordinary people have ordinary spirits that perhaps separate from the body at death. The pagan Plotinus ranked spirits. Only from the standpoint of the second position, the dyad, could anything be understood in a normal way. And from this perspective, the one is infinite and first, while the dyad, or sheer difference, is second. But spirit, the third position, is the recognition of the dyad as derivative from the one. The spirit, recognizing the dyad as derivative from the one, is the first actual cognition. But it is eternal, unchanging, in eternal motion, and wholly internal to the one, the dyad, and the spirit or triad. The ontological relations among these for Plotinus is that of overflowing. This is to say, the one eternally overflows to the next simplest thing, the dyad, which overflows to the next simplest, spirit or the triad. These are all internal to eternity. But spirit also must overflow to spirits with a small s, that temporally recognized first one thing and then another. The level of spirits overflow down and down until they reach the level of material spirit, with all sorts of passions, but with the capacity to overcome those passions. Of course, the levels of spirit go down and down and down, but the human spirit has an element that can detach itself and identify with higher levels. Eventually, some rare human spirits can become the alone reaching the alone, the one, or at least they can aim at that. Plotinus's vision had many Christian and some Jewish followers, and many Muslims once in the following centuries, each with his or her own version of this. Now, the Chinese have a version of spirit called qi. Like the West Asian notion of spirit, qi is something that moves with power and direction. Most generally, qi is a bunch of processes that bump against one another. The processes are never separate from one another, and perhaps it is best to speak of one qi with many processes within it. Generally, qi is never separate from li, or heaven. Li supplies the patterns of unification for the processes of qi, and is therefore to be found in any of these processes. A few people, for instance, Zhu Xi, suggest that Li is actually prior to and the source of qi, but most Chinese rest with the fundamental dualism of Li and qi, or heaven and earth. Most thinkers treat qi and Li as always continuing with no starting point or ending point. Some, usually Taoist sages, emphasize the eternal creation of the whole flow of qi, representing it as either infinite or as finite. Others take qi to have been created, beginning with a small point that expands into many branches of processes. Whether or not qi has a beginning, it has many forms, including large stable things such as star systems, or less stable, such as mountains, less stable yet, such as population densities of living species, down through the thoughts and emotions of individual human beings. Nothing happens in the world that is not some version or other of qi, and most versions combine in themselves vastly different versions. Of course, there is historical development in the notions of qi and li. Early on, they were associated with earth and heaven, but heaven was adopted as a rejection of Shangdi, who is a kind of weather god, a bit like Yahweh. About all that remained of a personal nature in heaven was its mandate, which was for the most part non-personal, at least in Confucianism. Earth, qi, was never thought of as personal. Persons for the Chinese were fairly far down in the evolutionary line, for those traditions holding to the evolution of qi. Persons were accounted for as the integration of bodily functions with capacities for feelings, intellect, and the judging or direction of activities. The essential acts of human nature are responsive, that is, acts that are complex in taking in information about the world, judging its nature, and valuing and responding in action. These responsive acts themselves are comprised of many other kinds of acts, not all of which are human, although all of which are processes of chi. Learning to be a good person means sorting out the layers of perceptions and mastering control over one's responses so that one can respond to the 10,000 things of the world with subtlety. There are two main alternative paths of learning. One, associated with Mencius, says that this learning naturally develops from within, so long as there are no temptations in the environment. The other, associated with Shinza, says that the elements of nature given a baby need to be supplemented by social rituals learned from parents and caregivers, and mainly from the highly structured, ritualized environment. Both the path of Mencius and that of Shinza recognize the importance and pervasiveness of ritual for the well-developed human being. For the Western tradition of Plotinus, the richest part of the unfolding process is its beginning with the one, unfolding to the dyad, and thence to the triad, and thence to the external relations down to the material world. The material world, with its bits of matter blocking spiritual penetration, is by itself less rich than immaterial spirits knowing one another, and this is less rich than the triad or world spirit. This seems to run counter to our evolutionary world that begins with the less rich and runs toward the more complex and rich. In our current evolutionary imagination, it remains open whether things will get richer and richer or will reach a limit and collapse. But then the Western notion of spirit is also balanced on whether evolution proceeds forever or collapses. By contrast, the Chinese traditions of Confucianism and Taoism imagine the start of things to be from nothing, not the fullness of being. Any determinate thing is a passage within time, but the existence of determinateness itself depends on the great ultimate of non-being, to use Zhou Dunye's phrase. So the Chinese way of imagining the workings of Qi and Li sees them as arising from nothingness. This is a powerful contrast with the Western way that sees the determinate things as arising from the pure fullness of being. Whereas the West prefers fullness, the East prefers simplicity. With its preference for fullness, the West also assumes that the person is somehow included within the origins. Perhaps in the finite sense are multiple centered beings with their wills and enticable to higher level spiritual forms of selfhood. Of course, the one and the dyad, and even the triad, are infinite in their ways. Nevertheless, there are traces of personhood in the sense of decisive, intelligent, emotional, and virtuous forms in the West's conception of the highest. With its preference for simplicity, the Chinese traditions mark the appearance of the person in the midst of the complicated Qi and Li. Nature is far richer and can be seen in all sorts of non-personal terms. Confucians and Taoists do spend most of their time talking about morals generally. In fact, the reason metaphysics plays less of a role in Confucianism is that the emphasis on simplicity says very little about morals. For the Chinese, the interest in persons is very much a moral concern, albeit one that roots morals in the metaphysics of Li and Qi. Qi and the spirit are both things that move and that have power and direction. But for the Chinese, Qi covers a whole range of nature that has no sense of personhood, whereas for the Western thinkers, spirit has personhood in its entire ontological reach. I myself agree with the Western tradition in its emphasis on the metaphysics of ultimacy, but I tend to agree more with the Chinese tradition that sees ultimacy in nothingness rather than in fullness. I agree also more with the Western tradition in emphasizing human nature, but with the Chinese tradition in seeing it as but a small, though important, part of much larger nature. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Neville. So we'll take, again, a couple of moments. Please enter in the chat your thoughts or comments or questions relative to this presentation.
It's all very clear, I'm sure, and extremely detailed.
In there, Bob, about the I Ching. Does the non-personal integrative aspects of Li and Qi, is that what underlies the divinatory use of the I Ching?
I'm sorry, could you say that again, please?
I typed it in the chat. I wrote it better than I could say it.
Right.
Yeah, does the non-personal integrative aspects of Li and Qi underlie the use of the I Ching? And what role does the personhood of the individual consulting it play in its outcomes? Is there an effect, or does it matter, or how does that work?
I think the I Ching is, it deals mainly only with Li, with principle. And it marks the paths through which processes can run. But reality is the running of the processes. It's not just the structure through which they run. So the I Ching is common to all parts of Chinese philosophy, and there are many debates about Li and Qi that take place within them. Here we go. From Gene Diller. Thank you, Bob. If there is time, I'd love for you to say more about your personal taste that Qi is both personal and nothing or not a thing. Thank you very much, Gene Diller, for that. I would say that Qi is personal only when it's related to actual human beings. The ancient Chinese believed that there were supermen and angels and all sorts of other things, but I don't believe that. And so I would say that Qi is personal only in that sense, and that other parts of Qi are not personal. So that means that for me, it's very important that we pay attention to what is really personal and not get involved in the personality of the cosmos, which is what a Neoplatonist like Plotinus would suggest.
Thank you very much. I think we'll move along. There are other comments, and we'll have a chance perhaps to come back to them at the end. But Professor Lee, why don't we turn to you?
Thank you, Professor Hein. Greetings. What has chi, or alternatively ki, got to do with the divine spirit, the third person of the Holy Trinity? From the early pioneering work of the Taiwanese theologian Chang Chun-shen to the Korean-American theologian Grace Ji-sun Kim, who is present here as one of the illustrious panelists. Discussion has been the driving theological leitmotif for their respective endeavors to construct a cross-cultural pneumatology that explores the possible contribution of the East Asian visual cultural heritage to global Christian theology. In this paper, I would like to add my small voice to the conversation. I will anchor my reflections on a reading of the 18th century Korean neo-Confucian thinker Im Sung-ju, whose honorific pen name is Nongmu. I will highlight the insights and questions engendered by his distinct conception of ki and explore what promises it might hold for Christian pneumatology and what difficulties it might encounter in serving as a fruitful resource for the latter. One of the fundamental claims made by the Christian scriptures about God is that God is spirit. As a translation of the original biblical terms ruach and pneuma, the word spirit has a rich semiotic connections to natural biophysical phenomena such as breath, wind, fire, water, and winged creatures, all of them metaphors for the power and energy of creation, and life, and healing that pervades the world. At the same time, in close connection with the biblical terms chokma and dabar, Greek Sophia and logos, the word spirit captures what is considered a psychic or spiritual, quote and unquote, phenomena, such as consciousness, feeling, thought, speech, understanding, knowledge, intelligence, and wisdom, all of which are claimed to have something of the divine in them. As the latter, so-called the psychic and spiritual phenomena largely presuppose a sense of intentional focus and centered activity, kind of rational coherence and purposiveness even. The concept of unified, self-integrative, and self-reflexive subject agency here becomes an indispensable and prominent interpretive category for the notion of spirit. So within the theistic world of Christian scriptures, that God is spirit implies that God is an intentional agent, conscious person. At the same time, however, the metaphoric connection of the term spirit to the material and the elemental confer upon that unified subject agent certain material and earthen qualities that strongly suggest its cosmic, embodied, and relational character. In other words, the intentionality, coherence, and unity of the divine spirit as subject agent go hand in hand with the sense of its being the cosmic power, permeating the ebb and flow of the universe and incarnate in the multitude of different yet interrelated forms of being and life within it. Hence, if the biblical affirmation God is spirit is to be taken seriously, then classical monotheism, grounded in the biblical idea of one God, as encapsulated in the Shema, must be paired with the biblical declaration that God is love, that God is intrinsically relational. And this pairing can be adequately substantiated only when one never loses sight of the boundary blurring character of spirit, occupying that liminal space between the one and many, ideal and material, mind and body, divine and creaturely, and metacosmic and cosmic. The boundary blurring nature of spirit, however, has been a theological thorn on the side of orthodoxy, hamstringing a serious attempt to think of the being of God as first and foremost spirit. Classical theism, encapsulated in the doctrine of the Trinity, was the product of a fine balancing act, resolutely affirming both Emmanuel, the mystery of God's creaturely flesh, on the one hand, and the burning bush, the truth that God is no creature, on the other. The conclusive elevation of the Holy Spirit to the ranks of the divine Trinity came, arguably, with the discovery, or one might say invention, of a conceptual apparatus, namely hypostasis, translated as person, in order to contain and to bring into stasis the wild and unpredictable energies emanating from the term spirit, because those energies, that is the Holy Spirit's intrinsic powers and activities, are by nature oriented to and seemingly in tune with creatures to the point of creating synergy with them, the energy is threatened to undermine the tiered platforms separating the divine and the creaturely that have been carefully erected to safeguard God's independence and freedom from creation. One could also say that the well-known distinction made by the Eastern Orthodox tradition, namely one between the one simple, unknowable, and unparticipable divine essence on the one hand, and the multitude of knowable and participable divine energies on the other, is another instance of the same balancing act, attempting to draw the conceptual perimeters within which the biblical notion of God as self-communicating and self-manifesting can be safely thought without prejudice to divine independence, freedom, dignity, and honor. Aware of the landmines strewn over the theological landscape, in my attempt to articulate the being of the Trinitarian God as first and foremost spirit, that is, God is first and foremost energy, I search in another wisdom tradition of the world for illumination and help. As is widely known, Neo-Confucian metaphysics, built up and systematized by its most influential Chung Su school, headed by Chu Shi, structures all of reality in terms of the relationship between Qi, variously translated as material force, vital cosmic energy, psychophysical energy, etc. on the one hand, and Li, again, variously translated as principle, pattern, coherence, and so on the other. Everything consists in a union of Li, which is normative, dynamically structuring metaphysical principle of reality, and Qi, the energy and stuff that actually bring each phenomenon into concrete existence. In other words, through Neo-Confucian metaphysics, places the very energy and stuff of the universe within an ontologically hierarchical relationship with its ground being is Sui Ren, the patterning, structuring, and harmonizing power at the root of the cosmos, namely Li. What I find both intriguing and confounding about this particular metaphysical account is the somewhat incongruous idea of the ultimate ideal principle of coherence and order, a kind of guideline, or in some instances schematic, seemingly functioning as the agent of ontological generation. Shouldn't Li, as dynamic ontological generativity, be construed also as a kind of energy rather than strictly as an ideal principle if it is to stand in for the act of ontological generation? This ambiguity in the overarching metaphysical architectonic of the dominant Neo-Confucian position has drawn my attention to Nongmun, whose conception of Li and Qi seems to lie outside the orbit of what was in his context the orthodoxy. According to Nongmun, Qi can be understood to have two modes, or better put, two layers. First, the cosmic Qi that circulates and coalesces to become the material and ideal stuff of every concrete phenomenon. And secondly, what he calls the original substance of Qi, 기지본체, or Qi Zi Ben Di, full of life-giving will, 생의 or 형이, that permeates the world of concrete entities to make them creative and living. To the latter, to the original substance of Qi, Nongmun applies various names, many of which are traditionally names of Li in the Neo-Confucian tradition. Heaven, original Qi, Qi of clear unity, great void, Tao, mandate, Lord on high, heart mind of heaven and earth, and even supreme ultimate, Tai Chi. In fact, Nongmun goes as far as to explain that Li is merely a name for the original substance of Qi, to designate specifically the latter's ordering and governing of creative processes. It is no wonder then that some traditional and contemporary readers of Nongmun regard him as a Qi monist. Nonetheless, Nongmun's layering of Qi seems to provide a sense of ontological depth to the energy of the universe. The original substance of Qi seems to possess what might be called imminent transcendence, which is another way of naming radical immanence. Although not directly accessible through the human senses, underneath every concrete actuality that is a key configuration, there lies the omnipresent original substance of key, supplying it with power of being and life. For example, Norman says, in the particular configuration of key that is a heap of manure, full of stench and filth, one cannot find any trace of the physical state of clear unity of the original key. Nevertheless, when the manure is given to the rice field as fertilizer, the latter's hundredfold yield gives witness to the efficacious presence of the life-giving will of the original substance of key. In other words, the original substance of key has no concrete physical existence within a particular spatial location and time span, yet it is universally and eternally present as the very generative matrix of being. This presence is confirmed by the ubiquitously observed effects of its generativity and creativity, namely its life-giving will, the flourishing of the myriad forms and configurations of cosmic energy. Norman says, and I quote, even though people say each thing consists of an individual key, the so-called original substance of key is definitely present in each, manifesting itself in accordance with the manner in which each configuration of key comes into being. If what comes into being is water, then this flow downward is no other than this original key manifesting itself and constituting the nature of water. If what comes into being is fire, then its flames shooting upward is none other than its original key manifesting itself and constituting the nature of fire. If we extrapolate from this, the way myriad creatures are like on the whole, although the individual natures of myriad creatures are different from one another, not a single one of them is not a product of the life-giving will of this original substance of key. One can say that Norman's account of the original substance of key is quite non-substantialist, and if we may borrow a Christian term, apophatic. The classical Chinese original for the word original substance is Guandi, which has the meaning of potential state or potency in the New Confucian Ti-Yong substance function paradigm. But the original substance of key does not have its own essence, form, pattern, or intelligible logos, nor does it possess its own concrete actuality. It is metaphorically dark, like the Taoist Wu or no thing, unintelligible except for its manifestation as the very ontological generativity underlying the pulsating world of evanescent energy forms. If it is a kind of potential state of potency, it is so only as the potency of each key configuration to come into being and become what it is according to its own nature. May we then venture to call the original substance of key divine, that is, call it divine key, in a sense analogous to the divine spirit. In terms of addressing the potential mind-body dualism that has plagued the history of Christian pneumatology, the most conceptions of key, not only Norman's, could serve as an effective medicine. As one of the English translations of key, chi, psychophysical energy indicates, all phenomena encompassing both ideal and material, mental and physical and spiritual and natural, are merely different configurations of chi, each pulsating in different yet mutually resonating frequencies. The classical Chinese terms most often was used to translate spirit, English spirit, namely shen and ling, both point to especially subtle, refined, and responsive configurations of qi, such as a brilliant intellect, enlightening wisdom, or a numinous consciousness, not to a class of entities belonging to an entirely different category of being or plane of existence from the mundane and ordinary earthen creatures. As such, qi does seem to serve as an excellent translation for the boundary-crossing nature of spirit. When it comes to the relationship between divine and creaturely, things appear to be a bit more complicated. From the perspective of classical theism, it may be a tall order to entertain the naming of the very being of God as divine chi or ki. Even with Norman's layering of chi to confer upon it a sense of ontological depth, that is, a sense of ontological asymmetry between the all-encompassing generative energy matrix on the one hand and concrete energy configurations on the other, the generative energy matrix is still energy. Whether in the sense of the Aristotelian dunamis, potentiality or potency, or energeia, actuality or act. Energy seems to be an intrinsically relational term. Energy, by definition, manifests itself through and engages realities and is experienced by realities. Hence, the energy matrix and the energy configurations appear to be bound together in a relationship of mutual determination. Just as the concrete configurations of qi are unthinkable without their generative energy matrix, it is equally hard to conceive of the original substance of qi being without the concrete actual energy configurations of qi, which it is the original substance. The world would have to be eternal, gripped in a relation of mutual determination with the divine ground of being. But perhaps that may turn out not to be as hard a pill to swallow as it initially appears, even if one is not kindly disposed to a Whiteheadian or Harshonian view of God, insofar as one's belief in the doctrine of creation out of nothingness is not enthralled to a literalistic temporal reading of the Genesis account of creation and the Revelation account of the end time. A major stumbling block for the classical theists, erected by the idea of eternal mutual determination of God and creation, is that it seems to imply the idea of a non-simple, mutable God, even if it is not meant in a temporal sense. God comes to be fully God only in relation to creation. There would be a logical movement from God's potency to act within God's self, from God's essence to God's existence, undermining the alleged unity and simplicity of God, if God's very being is to be a kind of energy, eternally in operation and at work to bring about an effect, an end, either in God's self or in some second term. The connotation of potential state carried by the term original substance in the Nongmun's original substance of qi does not seem to be particularly helpful here. As is well known, however, the Thomist conception of God as pure act is meant to avoid implying the existence of potentiality in God. God is eternally energized in the sense of having always already realized the divine end, and not in response to some creaturely call. And creatures are contingent, dependent recipients of God's creative act. While I don't have space to discuss the merits and demerits of this Thomist conception of God's being as energy, it seems to offer an intriguing possibility for Nongmun's layered conception of qi to have a fruitful career in Christian pneumatology. Could the term original substance be interpreted to mean a type of pure act, that is, act without potency? We have already seen that the original substance of qi is, in fact, non-substantialist, in the sense of its being without its own essence, pattern, logos, design, potentiality, or end, other than the life-giving will. And the life-giving will is eternal, ontological generativity, relentlessly realizing the ends of the myriad concrete configurations of qi, not its own end. If it has its own end, that would merely be the flourishing of the myriad creatures. Perhaps the Thomists would frown upon this as too much of a stretch from what Aquinas intended, and it may very well be. But yet in the domain of philosophical theology, it may be enough for something to be called divine if it is a cipher for the fundamental inclination toward value and harmony, that is, inclination toward a cosmos observed in the world, namely the boundless generativity at the root of things, captured by Nongmun with the notion of life-giving will. And for a Christian theology aspiring to be a theology without walls, that may be a good place to start. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will again invite your comments in the chat, but I guess we've set a pattern already, which is a good one. If someone wants to voice a question while others are writing for our speaker, please do go ahead and do so. Unmute yourself and ask your question. I note that one person has asked whether these papers will be available somewhere after this panel is concluded, and there's no provision at the moment for that, but I'm looking at Jerry and the presenters. We can pursue that subsequently, if the presenters will be willing to share their papers with me or with Jerry, we could find a way to distribute them to those who are interested. But you can think about that while we're proceeding.
I have
Rory,
a quick question, just for clarification. Would you map the Li with Logos and then Chi with Pneuma as roughly equivalent?
I wouldn't say they are equivalent terms, but there are overlapping areas. Actually, quite large an overlapping area between the term logos and Li, and also between the term pneuma and chi.
Could I ask a question about your reference to God as pure act or pure energy in the Thomist conception? I wonder what you see as the significance of the Trinity in that context, because in Aquinas and elsewhere, when he discusses God as pure act, it's usually not in a Trinitarian way. It's sort of building on that Aristotelian foundation. So there's no sense of that relationality that you earlier mentioned as being very important for the concept of energy. So do you see a role for the Trinity in that way?
Insofar as using that Thomist conception of pure act to provide a kind of a beachhead, so to speak. Sorry for military metaphor. For Nongmun to become a fruitful resource for Christian theology, I haven't gotten further than just the beginning on the level of philosophical theology. But doctrine of Trinity is something that, of course, I need to engage further to make sense of the original substance, Nongmun's original substance of Ki. In terms of the Trinitarian doctrine, how such a non-substantialist understanding of what might be called the ultimate ground of being or generative matrix could be understood or make sense in terms of the doctrine of the Trinity or the Trinitarian persons.
Thank you. I think we'll move along to give good space to our next two presenters, and Professor Kim, we'll turn to you.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with all these panelists and to go after the brilliant Dr. Lee. It's such an honor to be here. So thank you, everyone. I'm glad that I myself is on this panel, because I think it's important to hear another woman's voice here too. So my paper here is Spirit, Chi, and Christianity. So I'll read my paper as the other panelists have done. The world lives in tension between the East and the West. There appears to be a hierarchy of cultures, and the West perceives the East as the other, as the East is understood to be primitive, barbaric, and crude, while the West is advanced, civilized, and refined. Eastern philosophy, religions, society, language, culture, and traditions have been understood as inferior, irrational, and uncivilized. However, the knowledge that the West has generated about this other is more of a creative fiction than reality. Since the world is more globally interdependent, interwoven, and integrative, it is pertinent to be open to the cultural, spiritual, and religious understandings of the East. Understanding similarities and complementarianess between Eastern traditions and Western Christian traditions and spirituality will help correct the tendency in the West to make the East the other. It is important for Christianity to stop monopolizing the concept of the spirit, as a spirit is basic religious experience in many world religions. An examination will reveal that the Eastern concept of Chi and the Western understanding of the Spirit, of the Holy Spirit, have a striking resemblance to one another. This similarity opens the door for greater communication and dialogue. Qi, as the other panelists before me have mentioned, is an Eastern term for the life force energy, which manifests the idea of wind and spirit. Qi is commonly discussed in Asian cultures, but it is also found in all parts of the world, as most, if not all, ethnic groups have this concept of Qi. The Igbos of Nigeria call it Qi, Egyptians have Ka, the Hebrew have Ruha, the Japanese have Ki, and the Indians spelt Ki, similar to Korean, and the Indians call it Prana. In the Western tradition, the idea of Qi has a long history and can be traced to the 6th century BCE, when Meletus taught that everything emerges from breath, which condenses into matter, and finally all things dissolve back into breath-like energy again. This cosmic energy has also resurfaced from time to time in Europe. In the 8th century, Franz Mesmer claimed to utilize what he called animal magnetism. In the following century, Karl von Reichenbach spoke of the odic force, and in the 20th century, Reich professed to harness orgone energy. In Hawaii, the word for breath is ha, and healers are known as kahuna, or masters of the breath. People are greeted with a flower wreath and the word aloha. Aloha is translated as meeting face to face of the breath of life. So face is alo and life is ha. This breath or qi is given in exchange during a greeting. Thus, qi is understood as the energy which is connected in the external world with wind and internally with breath. In the Chinese worldview, qi is understood as air, breath of life, and that vitality. The Chinese character originated from the concept of cloud or vapor, which was regarded as a primordial vitality for prosperity and productivity. This character also means the act of feeding, and occasions means food itself. This seems natural because maintaining the vitality of a living being depends on nourishment. The integration of these two meanings conveys an expanding meaning of a state of fullness of vital energy achieved by eating food and breathing air. This description illustrates how the concept of qi gradually developed into the concept of vital energy, which is essential for life. The meaning of qi gradually expanded to the areas of heaven, earth, humanity, and all living things. The concept of qi appeared in the Yin era, which is 1751 to 1112 BCE, and came to denote what is central, hidden, right or righteous, high, supreme, remote, or distant, and ultimate. Qi also means what can be pursued to the ultimate end or the final cause, as well as out of which everything is produced or the first cause. Through the process of its entanglement, qi became elevated to a universal concept and ultimately to a philosophical category. Western language translations of qi include air, wind, vapor, breath, gas, vital spirit, appearance, intelligence, vital fluid, energy, material force, vital force, and subtle spirits. Qi is essential as it is what makes one alive and is life force which makes one a living being. Every living thing has qi, and it is the central animating element of our overall energy system, giving power and strength. It is a vital, dynamic, original power that permeates the entire universe and leads to an ultimate unity. During the Han Dynasty, Tong Chang Chu, dates are 206 BCE to 200 AD, defined qi as being similar to the air or ether, which is essential for life. The entire universe becomes a living organism because of qi. Even though qi has been understood as elusive, ambiguous, and without an unequivocal definition, it brings cohesiveness and order as it holds the universe together. Qi embraces life. Qi can be subjected to materialistic, idealistic, naturalistic, sociological, and metaphysical ideas. Yet it can function as a unifying factor, which at the same time manifests itself in other fundamental principles or aspects of humanity. Qi is transcendent, yet immanent. Everything in the world has its own qi, so long as it has purpose for which it exists. Qi is the ultimate power behind all things, and everything works towards a purpose for which its qi directs it. It is a dynamic power which produces life and liveliness in all things. Qi is not something static in the ground or in our bodies, as our qi alters the qi of places we use, and their qi alters our own. The qi of both places and the human qi interacting with it is strong enough to alter the lives of people who use those places. The good or bad energy of users of a place does linger to affect subsequent users, as our interaction with place is additive and cumulative. Therefore, it is important that we need to both design and live our lives aware of this dialogue. There are commonalities between qi and the Holy Spirit as understood within Christianity. Qi is this spirit is this foundational reality which makes it possible for humanity to practice their religious sense and elevate their self to the realm of the divine. Spirit is also one of the fundamental concepts in the history of philosophy. The concept of pneuma was first worked out in Greek thought, although there was no word as such, which had all the connotations and nuances of what we understand by the word spirit in our times. The word pneuma originally meant breath or movement of air and wind, and it came to be used as the breath of life in a human person. Qi and the Christian understanding of Holy Spirit share many commonalities. The Old Testament ruha and the New Testament pneuma carry the same ambiguity of multiple meanings as does qi, such as breath, air, wind, or soul. The word ruha has its etymological origins in air, which manifests itself in two distinctive forms, that of wind in nature and that of breath in living things. Because God as a spirit manifests herself as wind or ruha, she is also qi. Wind symbolizes the power of life in nature, while breath symbolizes the power of life in the living. Ruha means moving air, and it probably arose from the experience of the Hebrew people living in or near the desert. Such a natural desert phenomena as wind blowing sand was for them a fascinating and simultaneously terrifying reality that immediately affects their lives. The Hebrew people lived in fear of, and at times in awe of, the mighty blast of the Ruha. They believe that the desert wind has a divine and supernatural power. It became a metaphor for God. The anthropomorphic interpretation of Ruha as a personal spirit of God is added to the Old Testament. Israel developed her own peculiar theism based on the pre-Israelite concept of the divine wind under the influence of the monotheism of the covenant faith. Israel's description of Yahweh's unique power and spirit demonstrated at the Red Sea was formulated in tandem with the broader ancient Near Eastern concepts. Therefore, life-sustaining breath is a direct result of the divine in its creative power of Yahweh, who graciously bestowed life into creation. This breath is essential of life, and therefore to possess this life is breath, but the departure of this breath is death. Breath is a vital element in the living being, as it stands for life, dynamism, and the basic activity of a person. Therefore, the Spirit of God, Ruha, denotes the most important characteristics of the deity and plays a vital role in God's plan for the cosmos. In the Genesis 2 account of the creation story, God formed human beings from the dust of the ground and breathed into them the breath of life, and human beings became a living being. Chi, like pneuma, is translated as breath, energy, ether, or material force, but is better rendered as matter energy. Chi is pervasive in the universe, giving rise to all things, endowing them with life and energy. It is a substrative psychophysical reality underlying the world as it appears to our consciousness and corresponding in a way to the pneuma of the ancient Greeks. The great ultimate is full of Chi. Chi is not only all-pervasive reality, but also undifferentiated singleness. According to the concept of Chi, the distinction between wind and breath is simply one of the modes of manifestation. Chi is the essence of all life and all existence. Without Chi, life does not exist. And if there is no spirit, nothing living can exist. God, as a life-giving spirit, is a proper source of life and strength. In a derivative sense, Ruah also denotes the life force of the individual and of the group. In the New Testament, the role of the Spirit becomes more distinct, more Christological, and ecclesial. The Holy Spirit empowers Jesus in his salvific work from his conception through his ministry to the resurrection of the dead. The Spirit bears witness to Jesus by proclaiming his divine sonship, testifying to his coming in the flesh, enlightening. Okay, you can get rid of the 5 minutes. I could read my paper. Okay. Enlightening the individuals to recognize his soteriological significance and his lordship, and inspiring people to believe in him and his gospel of salvation. The one who breathed into Adam the breath of life now raises the second Adam to new life by the transformation of his body to a new form of bodily life. So to conclude, I wanted to have a little section on hybridity to show how even within Christianity, this hybrid understanding from the Eastern and the Western understanding of spirit and Chi will only enrich the Christian understanding of the spirit, because the Eastern understanding is more of an embodied understanding of the spirit, while as the Western European kind of Geist, Pneuma, Chi, Pneuma and Ruha understanding will be, to me, a more philosophical understanding. So I think bringing in the post-colonial concept of hybridity is important and will be helpful to the Christian understanding of the spirit. So to end, the recognition that the Asian concept of Chi and the Christian understanding of the Holy Spirit are similar raises the important question of why the West persists in its view of itself as superior to the West, when in fact the fundamental underlying religious and spiritual realities are similar and have points of contact that offer fertile ground for deeper exploration. Chi brings alternate approaches to methodological innovations of how one does theology, as it challenges the West to reclaim the spirit which is within us. Christianity tends to ask the Holy Spirit to come, while Qi makes a paradigm shift and reinforces that Qi is already within us and already have been, as it is what gives life. Spirit Qi is essentially what keeps humanity alive, as it is the life-giving force within us, and sustains and keeps us in harmony with nature and in the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Kim. So I think if someone would like to offer a question immediately, feel free to unmute yourself and do that. At the same time that people can put into the chat comments or questions they might have further. So the floor is open. It's a question. If you would like to ask a question, please do. I see one in the chat, which you may also be seeing, Professor Kim, if you would.
Okay. The question from Christy about hybridity. I think the question is about appropriation and hybridity. Hybridity is bringing the two together. So, in the sciences, we see animals or plants and the hybridity of bringing two, and then a new thing is being produced. In post-colonial theory, we also bring in two, and there is the mixing or the syncretism, whatever term you wish to say, and a new form or a new concept is being produced. For me, I think it's important. I think hybridity is an important way to do theology as a theological method. I think that's what's been happening in the last 2,000 years, at least Christian theology. Hybridity has always been there from the beginning, and it continues to happen. I think when white European theologians and Christian leaders did hybridity, nobody questioned it. But now when Eastern theologians like myself or Dr. Lee and few of us, Dr. John Tatalamo, we get kind of criticized of being syncretistic or some other terms that may be applied. But I think hybridity has always been present. And you see pagan practices being integrated into Christian practices, different philosophical concepts, Greek philosophy being integrated into Christian notions and Christian concepts. So it has always been there. And I think this intermixing, now that the world is shrinking and immigration, migration, refugees, etc., are coming together, I think the world is shrinking. And I think the more words and the more languages that we have, the better off we are in understanding and in doing theology. So even in my own theological work, I just combine it and I use either spirit slash chi or chi slash spirit, because I think the more words that we have and the more concepts, the more richer our understanding of spirit, divine will be. So I think comparing, I know Dr. Lee, who went before me, he didn't quite equate the two terms and saw the similarities. In many occasions for me, I think I go a bit further, and sometimes to me, it is almost the same. Either we use Holy Spirit or Chi. We could look at it kind of similarly. So thank you for asking that question. I probably took up most of my time for my Q&A already. I don't know, Mark.
Hopefully,
Mark, do we have time?
Have a chance to come back, but I think we'll give Professor Bradshaw a chance. I would say before we turn to him, all of our speakers, when Professor Bradshaw is finished and we've had a brief moment to do what we've done for others with him, I'll turn to you, then to you speakers, to ask if you have something you'd like to say in response to what you've heard from another talk or from a question still remaining in the chat. So that will be my agenda. So Professor Bradshaw.
Thank you. I think I may not be able to share my screen like I was hoping to, because I see you've enabled me, but when I go to that option, I'm not able to bring up the screen with my Word document. So I'll just go ahead and talk through this document. I apologize. I meant to be able to give you a handout or a screen with these texts printed on it. But still, it won't be hard just to talk through this.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but if you do have something in the form of a text, you could upload it into the chat that people could look at. It was my fault not to have been more technologically adept to be able to solve that problem for you.
Okay, that would take me. Let me see. I'm sure I can find a way to do that, but it would take me a few minutes. So
okay, then
just for the sake of time, I'll just go ahead and a lot of these are biblical texts that are very familiar anyway. So what I just want to do is to focus on this concept of energy as it appears in Eastern Orthodoxy, primarily the tradition of the Greek Church Fathers. But originally, of course, it is a Greek term, energeia, a word coined by Aristotle. And when it appears in the New Testament and other early Christian literature, it already has resonances that I think it acquires from its original philosophical use. So let me just begin by reminding you of how it appears in Aristotle himself. Someone already mentioned earlier the idea of God as, if you will, pure energy. Actus purus is the way it's translated into Latin. And Aristotle, when he articulates that in Metaphysics Lambda, he says that the prime mover, its ousia, its essence is energeia, actuality, and also activity. The word energeia has this kind of a fused sense in which it is the active, actual being, if you will, of God or the prime mover. And it's also, though, relational, as another previous speaker correctly mentioned, because in the prime mover it consists of this self-thinking thought. And I could go more into that, but just the other point out of Aristotle in the De Anima and elsewhere, when he's not talking about the prime mover, he presents, if you will, a sort of a more layered ontology in which energeia, energy or activity or actuality, is the manifestation of a sort of a prior level of ousia, essence, through dunamis, power, and then down to energeia, activity or actuality. And all these strands, or both these ideas, are very important coming out of the metaphysics and the De Anima. One later thinker, philosopher who does work with these ideas is Plotinus. I'm sure you're all familiar with, in Plotinus, what's called the theory of two acts, in which each lower hypostasis comes forth as the outer activity, energeia of the hypostasis prior to it. And Plotinus refers to that as the energeia ectes ousias, the energeia that comes forth from the ousia of the previous hypostasis. And so you get there in Plotinus a kind of an explicit duality of ousia and energeia, energy, in which the energeia is the manifestation and sort of the realization at a lower level of being of that prior ousia, hypostasis. Of course, in Plotinus, they are distinct as three different hypostases, and that won't be true in this Christian usage. So if you turn now to the Bible, first in the Old Testament, Hebrew scriptures, and the Septuagint, you don't have the word energeia itself, but you do have another concept that in some ways plays a similar role, that of the divine glory. And the divine glory is the radiant manifestation, the realization in a given place and time of God, who of course transcends that particular manifestation. You see this, in many places in the tabernacle, the temple, and elsewhere. And in Exodus 33, there's a really important passage where Moses prays to God to allow him to behold God's glory. And God says, you shall not see my face, but I'll put you in this cleft of the rock and I'll pass by, and you will see my backside. And at least as it was interpreted by the church fathers, that's sort of distinguishing God's face, with which no man can see and live, from his glory or his backside, which is that of God, the aspect of God, the manifestation of God that can be known and apprehended by creatures. If you go to the New Testament, then the word Energeia does appear about 24 times in different cognitive forms. And it carries over from Aristotle this sense I think it had in his Theology, the Prime Mover, of an activity that can enter into and kind of constitute the being of some subordinate being or creature. And so, and give it a kind of a life or vitality that it wouldn't have otherwise. So for instance, Colossians 1:29, Paul refers to himself as striving with the energy, the energia, that is being energomenein, realized or made effective in me. And that energia is the energia of God or Christ. And several other passages you could look at. Maybe the most important is 1 Corinthians 12, where Paul refers to the gifts of the Spirit, like healing and prophecy and so on, as energemata, things that are realized or made effective and actual by the Holy Spirit, who is energon, using the verbal form, those within the believers. So you have then the idea that the gifts of the Holy Spirit are forms, if you will, of divine energy. So already there in St. Paul. And there's also in Paul, if you will, a kind of demonic energy. Ephesians 2:2, he refers to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now energuntos, actively energizing in the children of disobedience. And that's an idea that the early church fathers picked up and did a lot with. They saw the worship of the pagan gods as a way of sort of being open to and opening oneself to demonic energies. That's an idea that occurs a lot in say, the Greek apologists. I won't try to go into more of that, but to focus more on the divine energy, let me just read a passage from Basil the Great in the 4th century, where you see then this contrast of the divine essence, ousia, and the energy, the energia. And the energy is something that's present and active in creatures. So he says, as is the power of seeing in the healthy eye, so is the energy of the spirit in the purified soul. Purified, that is, by asceticism, by obedience to God, by kind of a purification of the inner person. And as the skill in him who has acquired it, so is the grace of the Spirit ever present in the recipient, though not continuously active, energusa, whereas the skill is potentially in the artisan, but only realized or in operation, and energeia, when he is working in accordance with it. So also the Spirit is present with those who are worthy, but works, energe, as need requires, that is, in prophecies or in healings or in some other active realization of his powers. So there's this idea that the energy of the Spirit is constantly present in those who are purified, in other words, those who have sort of received the Spirit, but not always actively at work or realized. It's only when that gift of the Spirit is in fact sort of in operation. So that's one way in which you see this sort of duality of ousia, essence, and energy, energia. Let me just read another. This is a very famous passage from one of Basil's epistles, in which he kind of presents it in more cosmic terms. He says, we say that we know the greatness of God, his power, his wisdom, his goodness, his providence over creatures, and the justness of his judgment, but not his very essence or ousia. And this was a common theme in his controversy with Eunomius, who had a account of what the divine ousia is. Basil says, we don't know God's ousia. But God, he, that is Eunomius, he says is simple, and whatever attribute of him you have reckoned as knowable is of his essence, or ousia. The absurdities involved in this sophism are innumerable. When all these high attributes have been enumerated, are they all names of one essence? And is there the same mutual force in his awfulness and his loving kindness, his justice and his creative power, his foreknowledge and his requital, his majesty and his providence? In mentioning any of these, do we declare his essence? The energies are various, and the essence simple. But we say that we know our God from his energies, but do not undertake to approach near to his essence. His energies come down to us, but his essence remains beyond our reach. So there, as I said, it's a more cosmic kind of a picture in which the divine essence, almost like the sun, you might say, is sending forth its energies into the cosmos, not only into believers or the purified soul, but into all of creation in all these manifest forms as providence and justice and wisdom and goodness. And as he is present in all those different forms, it's again sort of like the way the sun is present in its beams and its radiation, while the sun itself remains sort of beyond and unaffected by the form in which it is present to creatures. So that's very much part of their picture as well, that the essence is eternal and unchanging and transcendent, and therefore unknowable to us, not knowable at least directly, but only as it is manifested in the energies. So let me just read one more passage then from Basil. He's a really rich source on this subject. And since, as previous speakers have pointed out, there's so much in commonality between the notion of spirit or pneuma and chi. This is from Basil's work on the Holy Spirit, where he again kind of draws this duality between essence and energy, specifically referring now to the Holy Spirit. He says, the Spirit is by nature unapproachable, apprehended by reason of its goodness, filling all things with its power, but communicated, participated by only the worthy, not shared in one measure, but distributing its energy according to the proportion of faith. In essence, simple, in powers various, wholly present in each and being wholly present everywhere, impassively divided and shared without loss, after the likeness of the sunbeam. Again, that analogy with the sun, whose kindly light falls on him who enjoys it as though it shone for him alone, yet illumines land and sea and mingles with the air. So here he's making use of that analogy with the sun to sort of clarify that the Spirit is equally present everywhere, although participated or communicated to some more than others in proportion to their faith. And so the fathers will often make use of an analogy like this. They'll talk about how the sun, you might say, even though it shines everywhere, it can be more clearly seen in a translucent diamond or something like that, rather than something that's opaque. So that's part of the role that this terminology of essence and energy plays for them. If you look at some of the later church fathers, like, say, John of Damascus, they pick up on this idea and thematize it even further. John, it will, what he does is to sort of synthesize this with Dionysius the Areopagite, the divine processions, that include goodness, beauty, being, life, wisdom, power, all of these processions of God that constitute creatures as what they are and are forms of divine presence, and the ways in which God is known and named. Of course, he writes about these in his book on the divine names. And it's a very similar sort of polarity, because the source of the divine processions is what Dionysius calls the hyperousios ousia, the essence beyond essence that has no name and is fully transcendent and sort of beyond. So anyway, John of Damascus then, writing after Dionysius, takes that whole Dionysian schema and sort of restates it now in terms of the divine energy. So this is from his work on the Orthodox faith. He says the divine irradiation, alampsis, and energy is one, simple and undivided, beneficently diversified in divisible things, dispensing to all of them the components of their proper nature, kind of constituting them as what they are, while remaining simple. Toward it all things tend, and in it they have their existence, and to all things it communicates their being in accordance with the nature of each. It is the being of things that are, and here he's almost directly echoing Dionysius. It is the being of things that are, the life of the living, the reason of the rational, and the intellectual act of those possessing intelligence. So that Dionysian picture is, for John, it's sort of, he's simply restating it, I think, in terms of the prior terminology of essence and energy, in order to kind of amplify this sense of God as actively present and sharing his goodness in all these manifest forms, as being, as life, as wisdom, as power, as beauty, or what have you, and thereby constituting creatures as what they are. And God himself is what they are to the extent that they are sort of fully realized in their being. Of course, you have to kind of complement this with something that Dionysius also talks about in the divine names, namely evil, and evil as the privation of being that comes about through the misuse of free will. So it's only evil that sort of impedes that full realization from taking place throughout the cosmos, you might say. So if you know much about later Greek patristics, Gregory Palamas in the 14th century is the Byzantine author who defends this picture, this essence and energy distinction in a sort of a dogmatic context in the course of what was called the Hesychus controversy. And as I see it, at least, he really doesn't add a lot that's necessarily going beyond these earlier authors, but he does thematize it. And it's at that point that this is sort of crystallized into dogma for the Orthodox Church. Of course, by that time, the Western Latin Church and the Eastern Greek-speaking Church had separated. So that's how this kind of came to be thought of as a distinctively Orthodox doctrine. But in my opinion, it's really not. It's really already there in the biblical text and the early church fathers. So I realized that was a very quick summary talk, but probably just as well to be quick, because that leaves more time for us all to discuss this together. So.
Well, thank you very much. I apologize again. I realized I could have just made you the host instead of me, and you would have been able to share, but that doesn't solve the problem retroactively. Sorry. Thank you for being so adept on your feet to be able to do that so well. So the floor, I'm going to give the floor first of all to our speakers, and for any response they would like to make. I'll begin with Professor Crace, if you would like to respond to a comment you've heard.
Yeah, I actually have I have two questions for the other panelists, if that's all right. One for David. I put it in the chat too. What's the difference between the Gnostic system of emanations and this Dionysian or whatever, the energies and processions? It seems like one is playing off the other in some sense, especially when you're speaking in terms of radiations and the like. Is it that I'm thinking here of against heresies, is it just that the Gnostic systems hypostasize the energies and call them gods, and is that the error, or what's going on there?
Yeah, I'd say that's part of the difference. What Palamas says is that the energies are hypostatic, that they exist only in some hypostasis, but they're not themselves hypostases. They're not distinct realities. But I think you have to kind of couple that with this synergistic sense and possibility that appears in those texts, say from Basil, or even going back to Paul, where Paul refers to the divine energy that's being realized and made effective, energeia, it's the passive form of that verb, energein, within him. Okay, so that's through his free activity, that divine energy is being made active and manifest. And as far as I'm aware, that's not something typically true in the Gnostic systems. You don't have this sort of synergistic relationship. Now, correct me if I'm wrong about that, because I don't know a lot about Gnosticism, but as far as I mean, that's what gives this such a sense of sort of intimacy and of spiritual vitality for them, that as you obey divine commandments, as you seek God in prayer, as you sort of open yourself to the full reality of what God is. That's a cooperative activity in which you're cooperating with the divine energy that's being realized and manifested within you. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's good. I like it. Yeah.
All right.
Did you have a second question? Did you have a second question? Yeah.
I have a second question for Professor Kim, if just real quick here. You were talking about, it seems to me when we move as Christians closer to like an Eastern understanding of chi, it becomes more embodied. And so I see that this embodiment of chi is played out in some of those psychosomatic practices of the East that aren't really incorporated so much in the Western tradition. I mean, you get the Hesychist tradition in Eastern Christianity, but then you have the yogic tradition in India. You have the Chan Wu Wei in China practices that's more integrative and holistic and includes the embodiment and things. And so my question is do you foresee any kind of, I don't know, breathing and bodily incorporations into Asian Christianity? Is this kind of a recovery of a more holistic view of chi? And what would that look like? In my encounters with, at least my encounters with evangelical Asian Christians, they're very conservative and very standoffish when it comes to incorporating anything that remotely looks like yoga or some of these other practices that may use bodily movements and breathing techniques to connect closer to God. So I was just wondering, do you see any trajectories there in terms of practical theology?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think in some traditions, historically and within Christianity, when they were doing meditative prayer, a lot of them actually used Buddhist forms of prayer and the breathing exercises. So you see this in the Middle Ages and around the Catholic tradition, and some of them still continue with the breathing tradition and the breathing prayer. So, and I see pockets of the more progressive Christians. I think, I grew up in the very conservative Christianity too, and you can't talk about things like this there. But I think in the more progressive, where people are seeking maybe spirituality versus religion, spirituality and Christianity kind of, people are recognizing that there is this link. Some of the health problems are psychosomatic in the fact that, it's all interlinked. And when we look at Western medicine, when they mapped out the bloodstream, that was very recent for Western doctors. In Chinese medicine, they mapped out the body qi flow thousands of years ago. They understood that if your qi was blocked, that's what caused a lot of pain. And that's where you see some of the Eastern medicine using acupuncture or other forms of medicine to make the qi flow within your body to heal that ailment. So, but I think in some Christian practices, I was invited before the pandemic to speak at some Catholic retreat in California, and they wanted to learn about breathing, prayer, and body movement. So I think the interest is there, and I think the more that we are able to learn from other traditions, the better off that Christianity will be, because we can't have this narrow scope and narrow perspective. We need to open up because, we are all created as finite beings, and we're trying to understand the infinite. So I think the more words that we have, I know one of the other panelists was talking about language and words, I think the better off that we will be. So, yeah, I don't know if I quite addressed your question.
You. No, that's great.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Grace. Yeah.
I'm going to turn to Bob Neville, but I see hands from Bede and Kurt. If your question is on something right now and that's currently being talked about, go ahead and unmute yourself and jump in if you'd like to in a shorthand way. Then
I can wait.
Okay, Kurt. Okay, yes, Bob. Would you like to respond to something you've heard or a question?
I'm somewhat disturbed by some of the speakers who treat qi as if it's has only to do with life. It seems to me that chi has to do with absolutely everything. And there's an awful lot in the world that is not alive. Now, it could be that the difficulty is with the notion of life. If you go from a mountain to a tree to a person, you get more and more life. But if you go from a person to a mountain to a tree to a mountain, you get more and more not life. Now, it's not death, but what is it? And I would like to see at least the Chinese notion of qi as genuinely universal. And then to see that the differences between aspects of qi is made by differences in li. So when you have a bunch of qi that is lively and human and talking and thinking and so forth, well, that's fine. But if you've got a tree, it perhaps has more life than a Western Cartesian would give it, but it certainly is not thinking the same way that human beings do. If you think about the whole cosmos, then there's an awful lot in the cosmos, an awful lot that is non-living in the human sense. So I would like to urge that upon us.
Would anyone like to respond to that? Did you have, at the risk of being provocative, Bob, did you have some particular statement or comment in mind?
Grace Kim's paper treats qi as being only living.
I'm not sure if I meant only living. I think what I was trying to infer is in the human being, because in the Asian tradition, qi is everywhere. It's in the cosmos. But I'm saying as a human being, when we die, the qi leaves us. I might have said that comment, but I don't think I was saying it's only limited to human beings. I've never written about something like that. So if I came across that way, I think that was a problem on my presentation, but in my own understanding, I'd have never thought of it that way, limited to human beings.
I think that it's very important for us to pay attention to the whole realm of qi and see the particular human part as very particular and small within the whole of nature.
Thanks for that interchange. So I'll turn to Dr. Lee. Would you like to respond to something you've heard, or to another panelist, or a question?
Maybe this question is directed to Professor Bradshaw. As I was hearing your presentation, especially about for example, Basil's distinction between divine Usia and divine Energeia, and that was kind of my thought process was kind of mixed up with the question that you posed about doctrine of the Trinity. I'm wondering, and this is for my own understanding and enlightenment, perhaps, but did Basil, for example, somehow find a way to articulate the distinction between divine Usia, divine essence, and divine energy in such a way that divine essence, although not knowable, right, and unparticipable, still is not like a nothing, right? Does he, for example, have a way of conveying the sense of what God really is, maybe that's probably mostly communicated through divine energies for phrases, as I understand your presentation. But is there something that is quite uniquely God and not of God, but not that come to us in response to God's relationship to creation? That's, I think, what I wanted to try to understand.
So are you asking how is there authentic knowledge of God given the limitations of our concepts? I mean, how is it about how do the energies enable authentic knowledge of God, or?
Right, but divine energies are always come to us, experienced by creatures, as I understand them, and therefore convey us a certain knowledge of God in relation to God, knowledge of God in relation to God's in creature, right? God's creation, and that's I guess part of course, the knowledge of divine essence. But is there a kind of pathway in Eastern Orthodox thinking towards understanding God as apart from creature, creation? Or is it just unknowable? We have no way of knowing what God is apart from God's relationship to creation.
Yeah. Well, if you excuse me, yes and no, because I think we know him as he manifests himself. But, you know, if you go back to, say, that story in Exodus, Moses being put in the cleft of the rock, he sees God's backside, and God's backside truly is God. You know, it truly is, but it's just one aspect of this much larger reality. And in a way, it's part of it's knowing God. I mean, to know God in that way is precisely to know that there is more beyond, right? I mean, that's very important through the whole of the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, that when God speaks, when he reveals himself, it's always as someone to whom there is much more than we can ever know or articulate. And I think they try to kind of retain that duality through this terminology of essence and energy. It's not as if the essence is just there, sort of static. And, you know, the essence is actively present and manifesting itself in the energy, but it manifests itself precisely as beyond our full knowing or apprehending. And in a way, it's a lot like any personal interaction, right? You know, whenever you talk to someone and you engage with that person, you know there's always more to that person beyond what you're seeing. So it's also got this sort of personal dimension to it. You know, so for them, concepts are important and you have to use concepts, but the concepts are always just sort of tokens of something that can never be fully articulated. And that's one reason they're not great dogmaticians in a way. They don't, you know, they don't develop a scholastic tradition in the way that the West did. So is that kind of what you're asking about? Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think I'm going to press on to let other panel members get an adequate chance here. So, Professor Kim, would you like to respond or ask a question, or you're going to?
I'm okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was that? What did they say in Congress? I yield my time. Thank you. So, Professor Bradshaw, would you like to initiate a comment or ask a question of someone else? Sure.
Well, let me just comment on one thing, and then I do have a question. Just Professor Kim a few minutes ago brought up the role of breathing exercises and how important they are in Eastern traditions. And I think that's a really fertile area for this kind of cross-cultural discussion. As you may know, you know, they're important in Eastern Orthodoxy as well. And in Orthodoxy, there's this polarity of the mind and the heart, okay? That the mind, the nous, is sort of the conscious awareness, but precisely because it's conscious, it works through the senses. It's sort of drawn abroad out into the world through the senses, and in a sense is sort of scattered abroad through the senses. And that's why we're subject to so many distractions and constantly changing in our thoughts. Whereas the heart is where divine grace is present. And, that's biblical. That's in Galatians and 2 Corinthians, how God gives his grace into the heart. And one of the purposes of prayer is to draw the mind into the heart, and they use breathing exercises partly to aid in that process. So actually, I do have a question about this, Professor Kim, since you mentioned this, and you and probably others here know a lot more about the Eastern practices than I do. Do you see any similarity there in what I've just said, so for them, the breathing is sort of a physical correlate to the activity of prayer that's seeking to sort of draw back in from that dispersion abroad through the senses into the presence of divine grace by concentrating the mind into this prayer, the Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner, that's said repetitively. I don't know, is that very similar to any of the breathing exercises that you were mentioning a few minutes ago?
I'm not sure if that is similar, but I know the breathing has been very important within the Eastern tradition. And, I mentioned aloha, the native Hawaiians, when they greeted one another, it was aloha. Ha means breath, and aloha is sharing the breath of God with you. So the understanding of the breath, and it goes back into the Hebrew scriptures where, God breathes and then gives life to the human beings that God has created. So I think the breathing has always been important in our understanding of the divine. And when I've also associated chi with vibration. So all that vibrates in creation, the air, when God had separated the Red Sea, that was the air, the vibration, it is all around us. So the spirit or the chi is all around because it vibrates. So I think the breath, the breathing vibration, in Koreans, in the Korean term, we say hansum, which is really taking this deep breath. So, as a parent, my mother always used to say hansum sha, which means, stop and take a breath. And we say that in the Western tradition too, deep breathing. But I think it is this recognition that you take pause and you breathe deeply and understand the chi or whatever other word that you're going to be familiar with, the divine, and understand the chi within you or the divine within you, the chi around you and the divine around you. So I think the breathing is important. And we see pockets of Christians who have done it in our whole history. And I think people are continuing to do it. I think it's a healing process for many people and so forth. But I didn't really address your question.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
But why don't we do this? I see Kurt and Bede have been patiently had their mechanically virtual hands raised for some time, and John also. Why don't I ask that you each ask your question, and then just to be sure that we don't kind of squeeze you out because of a long response to one. So Kurt, then Bede, then John.
Thanks so much for each paper, so helpful. And as not an indigenous, but a born Hawaiian, I really appreciated what you were bringing up, Grace. Bob really helped by laying out this East-West polarity, particularly between the nothingness and the fullness. And each of you, Dr. Lee and Dr. Bradshaw, had very important contributions. We've been on the being of God before, and I hope we always come back to it, or the ultimate. And Dr. Lee had this question, and I think it was hidden in something that Dr. Bradshaw quoted from from Basil, which is the unknowability of the being. And to push that a little further, all the way into the best of the 20th century reflections, that God's being is absolutely not creaturely, and therefore is without analogy. So whenever we are working with the presence in the biblical traditions, in the presence of the deity, it is always highly, let's say, the deity has clothed itself in terms and in energies and forms that are creaturely. Aspect from Basil that was very important is the simplicity of the being, which then brings us to circle back to the compatibility of nothingness and simplicity, or the divine being without analogy. One thought too from Meister Eckhart, affirming that God is nothing in the sense of no thing. And finally, just to resonate with much of this, those of us who are Christian, interacting and trying to get at the principle of hybridity, the practice, hybridification of ongoing theological work. So much of our Christian theology was shaped by liturgy and clergy training, and the scriptures are truncated, even flattened for the sake of those purposes, even legal purposes. But if we remember that everything we talk about in terms of Paul and the New Testament is based upon the Hellenization practices of the Jews in the diaspora and their translation of the Tanakh into Greek, which is a massive interpretation, absorbing the Plotinian and many other streams of Greek thought. The potential, and what I really appreciate about Dr. Lee is his deep penetration of the concepts, the Chinese and the Korean concepts as they've been appropriated, hinted at by Bob. We who are Westerners, we don't embody those concepts in the way that you do. But as in the same kinds of frustrations that Grace is expressing, much of the Asian Christian theology is just translated Western Christian theology. And so finding their own reading practice, kind of along the lines that Frank Clooney has spoken of in the commentarist traditions, where you're moving beyond or outside of the liturgical strictures into the narratology of the texts and the blending of those narratives in the practices of the reader in their own context, and finding these inspired connections. I really sense that Dr. Lee is doing that. And we're looking for this kind of work as a TWW outcome. And I just am very appreciative for where we are.
Thanks, Kurt. Bede?
I'll try to be as brief as possible. I just want to point out that the discussion has been kind of restricted in a couple of ways. Some of which have been already touched upon. One is to be careful to not think of Qi as one thing, but these different texts and these different traditions speak of Qi in many, many different ways. The other thing I'd like to point out is, in particular, the Taoist tradition, and even more particular, the Taoist tradition arising in the Song, with regard to this practice called internal alchemy, where the alchemist is in sitting meditation, absorbing the Qi of heaven and earth, and transforming the Qi in his own body to transform the body into a more spiritualized body. So in other words, one distinction I'm picking up on here, I'm trying to point out, is that one ascends to the divine, to use that word, or transcends, to use that word, not through intellect, right? Not through the soul, but actually through the transformation of the body. You transform the body first, and then comes mind and intellect. Thank you.
Hey, John?
This has been a very rich and rewarding panel indeed. I think my question is a question for David. One way to read this panel, I know I'm generalizing across a variety of very fine particular presentations, is that if we work with East Asian concepts, we can move rather directly to concepts of ultimacy in which the ultimate is energy. Whereas we're still, when speaking within the Orthodox lens, needing to make the distinction between essence and energy. And so my question is, what's at stake in that? I mean, is this really just a matter of preserving the fundamental, hiatus between created and uncreated? If the divine is energetic in its operations, and you don't install a gap between essence and energy, the risk presumably for orthodoxy is that wall between the created and uncreated gets kind of murky. So is that really the issue? I mean, you seem to actually be very open, David, to the metaphors of energy that have been swirling around this conversation. Do we still need to maintain this fundamental hiatus? I see no reason in anything that Bob said or anyone else said, because I guess worries about pantheism as such or non-dualism just aren't really operative. I mean, so anyway, I'm eager to hear what you have to say, Dave.
Yeah, thanks. So you're certainly right that, to maintain the distinction of creature and creator is important. But I would add to that for people like Basil, Gregory Nazianzen, his friend, it's also important that there's a kind of erotic drive to the divine. And part of Eros in their thinking is the desire to sort of know better, right? To penetrate further into the knowledge of this one to whom you are drawn and attracted, and to take those present manifestations, whatever they are, as just sort of the springboard for further and further and further. And it's an unending process, So Gregor of Nyssa, who was Basil's brother, is famous for this notion of epixtasis, the unending reaching out to the divine that continues even in the afterlife. So that's part of it for them too. This polarity, is not fixed. There's not like a fixed wall between essence and energy. It's more like a receding horizon, where as you penetrate further, there's always more beyond. And as to, the language of ultimacy, you mentioned that, so on the more purely Eastern view, that energy itself is what's ultimate. In a way that I think that Orthodox could embrace that, just in the sense that God as manifested is always energy in some form. But there's also then this receding horizon, which is pointing you forward beyond to the source of that. And as you move in that direction, the horizon is always still there. So does that kind of get at what you're asking about?
Fantastic, David. Thank you for the erotic element there.
Yeah.
Could I say something in this regard?
Please do.
It seems to me that John is exactly right in pointing out that it's just one way of looking at the world, to see the movement toward ultimacy to be a movement toward what's personal. And it's a different way of looking at the world to see what is simpler and simpler, and surely not personal, and maybe just plain nothing as being the source. I prefer nothing. And so it seems to me that what that means is that the world is absolutely contingent. And if it's absolutely contingent, then, well, it's happened because here we are. But then that means that nothing has been really productive. So that's different. And to be comparative means that we take all these into account, and we need to give bigger and better arguments than we have so far.
To the end of our time, but if someone has been blocked so far from asking a question or making a comment that you haven't gotten a chance online, you're free to unmute yourself and speak up in the moments remaining.
What struck me, if I can speak up in this last minute, from just what Bob Neville was just saying, Heidegger said the nothings.
Right.
Well, I don't think Bob Neville's nothing, just nothings.
No, it
energy.
I think it does something.
Yes, but it doesn't do so because of its nature, not because of some kind of super essence or anything like that. And it's this is not a program that's based upon my theory, but if it were, that's what I would say.
Yeah, thank you.
Steve Bidlack noted in the chat that for those who want more nothing or more non-dualism, there is a session pursuing that still to come. So many thanks again to all our presenters today for this very rich program. Thanks to those who organized it. And we'll see some of you in a session not too long from now, I hope. So go in peace.